All right. Very happy to announce that we are finally back after the Corona break with the OASIS Lunchtime Talks. And today our first speaker is Mikko Meriläinen from our own research group. Mikko has studied the gaming literacies or Bildung or Sivistus in the past, for example, in his dissertation. And after that he has studied things like gaming during Corona, game jams and youth gaming. However, today you're talking about something else, which is miniature wargaming, and I'm really looking forward to this talk. So welcome, Mikko.
Thank you very much. So happy. It's now afternoon. It's 1 minute past noon. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mikko Meriläinen, and as Jaakko mentioned, I'm from the Tampere Game Research Lab, and today I'll be looking into miniaturing research, which I have been doing for a couple of years now as a kind of a side project. Today will be a fairly quick look into what are miniatures and what is miniaturing, and that will probably take us the 20 or 30 minutes. It's going to be hopefully quite concise. A few words about me. As said, well, Jaakko discussed my previous research. I'm not going to repeat everything. I'm very much interested in games and play as part of everyday life, and that's kind of a big reason why I got into miniaturing as well, because I have been doing miniatures since age 14, I think, and even before that with my older brothers. They were playing role-playing games and they had miniatures, so I was playing with their minis, even if I wasn't always playing the games themselves, but I probably destroyed quite a few now out of production, quite valuable miniatures while smashing them together in my initial miniature games. I'll start off with what are miniatures. I have to say that during this presentation I will be showing you quite a few photos. They are all mostly from my own collection. They have been painted by myself. For once it was very easy to find pictures for a lecture, which is surprisingly fun. I will be discussing the subject both from the perspective of a researcher, but also as a miniature enthusiast. I have, of course, 25 years of personal experience with miniatures, so that will inevitably intertwine with my discussion as a researcher. When we are talking about miniatures, we are basically discussing small miniature figurines. Basically toy soldiers, if you want to use that term, often made out of metal or nowadays more commonly plastic. Historically they were made out of metal. They were made out of alloys with lead in them, so people still refer to miniatures as lead, as kind of an affectionate word for them. They are usually delivered unpainted, but there are more pre-painted versions available nowadays, and as you can see, these are ones that I have painted myself with my own tiny hands and my tiny brushes. And what we use miniatures for, they're often used for gaming. They are used for wargaming, such as Warhammer 40,000 is probably, and the Warhammer franchise are probably the most best known ones, or in kind of tactical combat situations in role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. So these are the domains they are most commonly associated with, although of course they aren't the only ways of using miniatures, which I will discuss today. Of course, while a lot of miniatures are about fantasy themes, historically there have been a lot of miniatures that draw from a kind of historical wargaming background, so we have still quite a lot of different historical miniatures as well. Miniatures come in very, very different sizes, from 2 millimeter tall, very, very tiny miniatures, to models that basically question already, like what can we define as a miniature, like 75 millimeter tall small sculptures. Miniatures are sculpted traditionally by hand, previously mostly using different epoxy putties, but nowadays quite commonly using 3D technology, so we're discussing 3D sculpting, and also 3D printing has become a large phenomenon in recent years. And for example, all of these miniatures shown here, I have printed them myself using my own resin printer at home. So this is kind of probably the next step that will sort of revolutionize the hobby, or at least to an extent. And of course, while miniaturing has quite long roots back into history, all miniatures will be happy to point out that, oh, you know, it started with Greek spiel kind of thing. So everyone will always remind you of the 18th century kind of background, and then move on to the 1920s wargaming stuff. When basically we are discussing contemporary miniaturing, we are talking about the phenomenon that started in the 70s and 80s in the UK mostly, and coinciding with the start of maybe the first wave of role-playing games, so the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, for example. And this is when most people got their first touch with miniaturing culture, and then the next wave kind of followed in the early 90s. That's basically when I started out my miniaturing. So in 1996, I think I had been 14 years old, and that's when I started buying my own miniatures. So we got some of the first Warhammer boxed sets, for example, games like Space Crusade and Hero Quest that are a lot of people of a certain age know from their childhood. So larger manufacturers like Milton Bradley cooperated with Games Workshop to use some of their IPs and release these kind of like simplified board games using miniatures, and that's been the first engagement for a lot of people with miniatures. So this is what we are discussing. Why we should do miniaturing research? Why did I start doing miniaturing research? Well, first of all, there is very little research into miniatures in game studies, surprisingly little, compared to, for example, role-playing game research, or compared to live-action role-playing game research, board game research. Miniaturing research, there is a handful of it. It's very slowly growing, but for example, currently in this room, there are approximately 20% of the world's active miniature gaming research, or at least ones we know of. So there's Ville in the audience, and Jaakko as well, and myself. So there isn't a lot. If you are looking for topics for research, study miniatures. They're excellent. There are lots of exciting and interesting approaches into studying miniatures, as hopefully will become clear in the next 20 minutes or so. And of course, a third very important factor of why do miniaturing research and why I started doing it is that miniatures are really great. I love miniatures. I have tons of miniatures, so I might as well spend my time studying them while I have them. So also, on a more serious note, this kind of allows me to use this sort of hobbyist perspective and kind of this silent knowledge gathered throughout 25 years of dealing with miniatures, something that would be quite difficult to grasp if I were approaching miniatures completely from an outsider researcher perspective. And of course, it's always very motivating to study something that is very dear to you. The lecture today, or the talk today, is grounded in our study of 127 Finnish adult miniaturists. It should be noted at this point that we are discussing the very little research that has gone into miniatures and miniaturing, is that we had to come up with a word. We had to come up with the word miniaturist and miniaturing to refer to the activity. There was a lot of discussion of gaming with miniatures, or wargaming, but there wasn't a word for the broader pastime, which includes quite a lot of different things. And we had 3 individual studies. I'll show you the sources at the end of the lecture. So one focused on miniaturing in general, just describing the phenomenon. The other one focused on the materiality in miniatures. And of course, we are dealing with physical miniatures, so materiality plays a large part here. And then the third one is about collecting and hoarding miniatures, which is very familiar to a lot of miniature enthusiasts. It is much quicker to buy miniatures than to paint them, for example. Things we found out. They are shocking things. They even shock this cloaker. So we found out that miniaturing is actually a bunch of different things, not a single thing, and that miniatures are a bunch of different things as well. As an anecdote, the cloaker here is a representation of a Dungeons and Dragons monster that disguises itself as a cloak and waits for the character to wear it and then bites into them. This is universally considered one of the ugliest miniatures produced. I find it very endearing. I bought it just for the sheer fun of painting such a lump of lead, and I will say that the unpainted version looks much worse even. But yes, I always try to include the cloaker out of sympathy, and because they deserve to be seen. But yes, different things which we'll look into right now. So miniaturing is kind of first and foremost. Miniaturing is crafting. This is me crafting miniatures or painting miniatures, being helped with a cat that we were sitting Columbus. He was very helpful in miniature painting, provided a certain extra degree of challenge. But a large component of miniaturing is the actual painting of the miniatures. That's the part of the hobby a lot of people enjoy. It has this very strong component of working with your hands, of something similar to doing other arts and crafts. So instead of just the gaming aspect, you are doing actually something completely different. Basically just painting by numbers. So you are looking at the different areas on the model and then painting them using the usually acrylic colors. And of course the crafting is not limited to just the painting, but there is also people are building terrain, for example. They're building houses and battlefields and everything. People are converting miniatures, so chopping miniatures up and posing them differently, or combining different sets of miniatures, changing heads, changing weapons, doing everything imaginable. So it's a very creative hobby, and there is a lot to do besides just playing games. And of course there are some miniaturists who don't even play the games at all, so they just enjoy the crafting part, and they enjoy the different parts of the hobby apart from the gaming. I, for example, I play games very rarely. They are quite fun, but they're not the part of the pastime that I enjoy the most. I do like the painting quite a lot, and especially if there's a cat involved, there's an extra kind of bonus aspect to it. Then of course it is also gaming, and this is an interesting aspect of the research, because as mentioned before, a lot of the research discusses wargaming or miniature gaming, but that's only one part, although a very important part. So miniatures are still sold as gaming pieces. They're sold as gaming miniatures first and foremost, and usually they're tied to a gaming franchise such as Games Workshop's Warhammer series. The most typical ways of using them for gaming are, as mentioned, they're used in miniature games such as Space Hulk here, a custom version played with colonial marine miniatures from the Aliens franchise, or they're used for role-playing games to illustrate players' characters in a physical form. These two things form the core of miniaturing for most people. While there are other aspects which I'll look into, these are usually the two main things that people enjoy in miniaturing, and these usually take like primacy in the pastime. So next we have collecting, illustrated with a meme very familiar to a lot of miniaturists. So as the meme suggests, and as I mentioned, a lot of people buy a lot of miniatures. So buying miniatures is an important part of the miniaturing experience. It's very quick to buy models. You only need to go to a store and give the store clerk some money, and then you get miniatures. That takes very little time, but the painting takes a lot more time, which means that hobbyists often accumulate quite a large amount of miniatures, often referred quite jokingly to as a pile of shame. So there is this idea that you have this kind of shame that you have bought much more miniatures than you can actually paint. But it should be mentioned that usually this kind of, while we use the words pile of shame, it can often be a pile of pride as well. So it's also a sign of your commitment to the hobby. It's also a sign of, it's a promise of things to come, like, I have miniatures for the next 10 or 15 years to paint. Or it can even be a prideful thing in a sort of way that you can kind of use it as a miniaturing capital sort of approach, where you are, it's such a shame, I have a box full of 80s out of production models that I don't have the time to paint. Oh, shameful me, where of course it's basically just bragging that you are really much, you have old school miniatures which are really cool and quite expensive as well. But the collecting part is very, very important. It's something that a lot of people enjoy about the hobby as well. Miniaturing is also storytelling. This is another important factor for me. Here are some of my pirates set up in my pirate town, which is currently quite large. So I have been working on a pirate miniatures project since 2015. And as you can see, you can hopefully clearly tell what's going on. There's a pirate about to be hanged. There's a priest giving him his last rites. There are some 18th century redcoats keeping watch. One of them is very tired. It's probably very hot out there because you're somewhere in the Caribbean. One of them's been injured, so they're probably posted in the middle of nowhere, and they maybe wouldn't like to be there. And in the background, you have some other pirates looking on at what's happening. This isn't a part of a game. This is just something that I set up for my own enjoyment and for taking nice pictures like this. So, in this sense, miniaturing can be a way of storytelling, a way of photo play, basically, where it allows us to express ourselves and tell stories. It doesn't have to include the gaming, but of course these are also, as you can see from the bases and everything and from the terrain, they are made with gaming in mind, but I don't have to use them for gaming. I can use them for this kind of play as well as gaming. And of course we can tell stories not just by photo playing with miniatures, we can tell stories by coming up with backstories for miniatures, and as people often do, or adding details to different models. Maybe I decide to paint or convert one of the models, maybe one of the pirates. I will cut off the model's leg and put in a small peg leg, a small wooden leg, and already that's telling a kind of narrative. I have decided that this character has lost their leg at some point. Some people go as far as writing entire backstories or novellas for their armies and their characters. And here is, of course, where miniaturing also overlaps a lot with role-playing games, for example. And people will often create miniatures for their role-playing game characters, and then you have a different layer of storytelling added there. Miniaturing is also about displaying and appreciating miniatures, both physically placing them on your shelf, for example, or in a more increasing number by the day, using things like Instagram or Facebook groups and Twitter and so on. I've added this dragon here because for a long while this was the best miniature I had painted, and I'm still quite proud of it. It's quite a nice model. It had been sitting in my cupboard for I think 15 years. I had bought it and then looked at it. Yeah, this is really nice, but it's much too daunting for me to paint. And then one day I just decided to paint it, and it came out quite nicely. The base has some really cheap glittery nail polish added to it, so there are like small flakes of gold to represent gold coins. But yes, so obviously miniaturing is a very visual hobby, as you can see. So people, of course, tend to share. Tend to comment on each other's paint jobs, ask for tips, and so on and so on. And then miniaturing is, of course, also socializing. So a couple of weeks ago I went to Dublin to play some miniature games with my friends. As you can see, we had a lot of fun, and yes, I did ask for their permission to share this photo on this lecture. But yes, I do find it kind of fascinating. So much like many other hobbies, miniaturing brings people together. So people are interested in similar things, and all of these people here, there are two people here that I have met, I think 10 or 15, almost 15 years ago, because they also have miniaturing blogs, and we started commenting on each other's blog posts. We have become friends since, and these are some of their friends also joining in. And I think there is something excellent there, that all of us, like grown adult men, came together, some of us traveled to a different country just to spend a couple of days playing with fantasy pirates. And that's somehow very wonderful. At 39 years old, I was the youngest of the group as well, so that's also something to my credit. But yes, so the socializing aspect is an important part of it, not just for the gaming, but for keeping up enthusiasm during projects, discussing ideas. People like to paint together as well. For some, it's a very solitary activity, but others like to come together to paint. People will play games with their parents or with their children, and so on and so on and so on. Big conventions can draw in lots and lots of players for tournaments, for example. And it's a very important aspect, whether it's happening face-to-face or online. So this is miniaturing. A lot of different things that are going on. And then what about the miniatures themselves? I decided not to do a whole nother 4-page thing, so I'll just go through these here. So what are miniatures? You would think that they're very simple things, and of course, in a sense they are, but they're also not. First of all, of course, they're physical objects. And this is an important part of miniaturing, because they are physical objects. That means that, for example, they take up space. You have to have some space to put your miniatures in, and the longer usually you are in the pastime, the more space they start taking up. So there is a whole genre of people thinking about clever storage solutions for their miniatures. There are companies that are catering to miniaturists, and they're creating carry cases and storage boxes and this kind of thing. We are currently considering buying a house, and one of the considerations is that there has to be room for storing miniatures, which is either funny or tragic or a little bit of both. But of course it also brings this kind of physicality that isn't there with, for example, or in a similar sense isn't there, for example, in digital games. So you have objects that you can handle, you have objects that you can paint, that you can convert, chop up, you have objects that you can drop on the floor and break, or things that your dog can chew up or your child can snap apart. And this brings the previously discussed crafting element to the fore. So it's not just dealing with kind of abstract or digital data, but you're working with your hands. And some people, for example, consider themselves, when they're working with miniatures, they don't think of themselves as kind of hobbyists or gamers necessarily, but as artists or craftspeople. So there is this very intriguing dimension to it. Then miniatures they're usable items, so they are used for gaming, they are used as display pieces, they have uses, so they're not just stuff. And it's important to remember that the word use can have many meanings, and for example, using miniatures for displaying them is a very valid use of miniatures. You don't have to play a game with miniatures to be using them. Collecting miniatures, that can be another use for miniatures. You can buy a miniature, put it in a storage box, file it away in your closet, and that's also a way of using it. That can also bring some very different views towards miniatures. To our surprise, in our research data, while many of the miniaturists were very much involved in their miniatures, they came up with backstories and everything, a lot of the role-playing gamers who were using miniatures, they had a very kind of not a very intense relationship with their miniatures. They were just saying that, well, these are basically gaming tokens. They're like pennies, but nicer. But there wasn't this kind of commitment to the miniatures, because for a lot of these respondents, the storytelling didn't happen with the miniatures. The storytelling happened in the role-playing game, in the interactions between the players, and the miniatures were just kind of these physical representations, like gaming tokens. And this was a very different use compared to the miniaturist who writes a long backstory and has every single character named in their army. And then, as already kind of mentioned in the storytelling part, they are fuel for the imagination, they're an outlet for the imagination. It can be quite easy to tell stories with miniatures or use them for storytelling. Already, you can see here there is a ruined corner of a building. There is a very recognizable miniature to some of you, I assume. This is a goblin from the Hero Quest game, a very classic model. And already you can kind of see that they have like a very sneaky face. Like already the model it's kind of telling a little story, isn't it? They have a rusty little axe, and they don't look like they're going to be very friendly. They might be asking you for money later. But this is another way that we can use miniatures to express ourselves, and at the same time, because miniatures are made to be interesting, they are made to be like self-contained small stories at best, then it can become this kind of loop where the miniature fuels your imagination and then your imagination feeds back into the miniature. In this case, they are usually painted green. Traditionally, you paint goblin miniatures green for reasons. I decided to paint mine a mustard yellow. That's a massive stroke of creativity there. But it also, again, this feeds into a small kind of story where these are goblins and they're living far underground and there's not a lot of sunlight, so they become these kind of like pale, mustardy creatures. And already that's again my imagination working. I'm having a fun time. And then miniatures are as well, they're emotionally, they can be very engaging in different ways, partly because you put a lot of work into them. You paint them, you buy them, you plan out your projects, you invest a lot in them. They can be kind of like your babies. You've spent a long time painting them. If it's a very, very nice piece, if it's a larger piece, people can easily spend anything from 20 to 100 hours painting a model or even more. So it becomes a massive investment in terms of time and kind of emotional engagement. And of course, there's also the nostalgia aspect. So as mentioned, for a lot of people, this is familiar maybe from your childhood. Maybe this is something, for some reason, most geeks that I know have at least a couple of these around their home somewhere. Just because, even if they don't have the Hero Quest game, they have at least a couple of goblins kicking about, because the game was very popular, and then people were just playing with the minis. But there is a large nostalgia aspect, and of course nowadays, with a lot of miniaturists are now in their 30s and 40s, 50s, they are looking back into the miniatures they played with when they were kids, which are of course now 80s out of production models that are becoming quite valuable. So there are entire communities that are devoted to this kind of out of production old school miniatures, and of course there's an element of things used to be much better back then to it. But that's also this kind of emotional engagement. That was before everything was ruined by kids coming into the hobby and cash grabbing, and everything became so commercial and this kind of thing. So a different kind of emotional investment there as well. The talk is nearly over, and I want to finish this with a kind of final encapsulation of why I like miniatures a lot. So in this picture you see a rock and some miniatures. But of course this isn't a rock. This is a piece of bark from our summer place. It's been brought home, it's been dried in my oven, making the whole house or the whole apartment smell like pine. There's some miniaturing grass here, a bush. There is a piece from an IKEA fake rosemary plant. So basically what you have is rubbish. But you paint it, you put it all together, and this is clearly a rock. There is a kind of like a tropical plant there, so this is a rock in the Caribbean. And this is the kind of transformation that I like. The same thing here. They are miniatures I have painted. They are miniatures I've bought from different manufacturers. Some of them are metal, some of them are plastic, and they are from a variety of lines of miniatures. Here is, for example, an old, old Rochefort from an old Three Musketeers miniatures line. And these characters they are my pirate hunter crew. They are this kind of nasty crew that hunts pirates, and they're almost criminals themselves. You can see they have quite cruel faces, and they have eye patches, and they're this kind of ensemble cast from a movie where like the Expendables, where every single character has their own kind of quirk. You have the sisters here who come from a noble background. They're very rich, but they have decided to take up pirate hunting. There's the veteran redcoat who has basically become quite unhinged and is basically looking for reasons to beat people up. there's the quiet sharpshooter, there is the big guy. You know all these tropes. You know the characters from countless movies and comics. And the reason why this is so wonderful is that, like, I can be here as an almost 40-year-old getting excited about toy soldiers this size and making up stories for them. And I think that that's the best thing in the world, basically. That's the most exciting thing in the world I can think of. And that's a lot of fun. And also kind of same transformation here, where I can take a bunch of rubbish, glue it together, paint it, and it becomes something else entirely, and it starts telling a story all by itself. So this is what could be termed led fantasies. So miniatures help us do a lot more things that you could maybe expect tiny toy soldiers to do. Thank you very much.
All right. Any questions for Mikko?
White metal fantasies.
Sorry?
White metal
Yes,
fantasies.
white metal fantasies nowadays, so non-toxic fantasies. Feel free to chew on them.
There's a question on YouTube. Any pirate miniatures with scurvy?
I have painted a few beggars who I assume have scurvy, and there are also lines of pirates who have been made to look kind of very dirty and very nasty. So there is definitely a variety of pirates. Some of them are of the more romantic Hollywood variety, and others are the more scurvier kind. I might have to mention that as a result of getting into pirates and pirate miniatures initially, I became very interested in pirates in general, and I now have maybe 50 books on pirates, all because of buying a pack of pirate miniatures. I have several books on scurvy, which I am really proud of.
Thanks, Mikko. Fascinating presentation. I was just wondering, what about the colonial miniatures? Because there are lots of miniatures of colonial armies, and also there's a whole culture of culture of playing with them, and that connects to the reenactment of the battles and things like that.
Yeah, that's actually something. So there was a question, in case you didn't hear, there was a question about kind of like the colonial miniatures and colonialism in miniature, and that's something that there's been a lot of discussion in the community, especially in the kind of, well, let's say that in the kind of communities that I frequent. Some people will consider these kind of questions the same as in digital games. So, like, why bring politics into this? And there is nothing political about this. But there has been a lot more kind of maybe sensitivity in addressing these issues. I had to think about it, of course, when doing the pirate project. For example, my project doesn't have any characters that are enslaved. They are characters who are former slaves and kind of maroons. But I did not want to represent slaves, for example, in my games, even though that would have been historically accurate. There are, of course, discussions when people are playing different eras and playing war games of different eras. There is inevitably going to be like these. For example, the Zulu War period is a very familiar one. It's visually very striking because you have the instantly recognizable kind of thin red line of red-coated troops with their pith helmets, and then you have the large armies of Zulu warriors with their very finely decorated shields, so that it's a very visually striking thing. But of course, it does kind of necessitate discussion of what we are representing in our games, how we are representing them. And another very interesting discussion is for example, the kind of sidetracking already a little bit, but for example, the gaming of contemporary conflicts. There are already, for example, there are miniature rules and scenarios for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then I think we are ethically in quite tricky in a tricky situation when we consider like what do we want to represent and in what way. But to compress all of this, there is more consideration, but there should be more as well.
Thanks for a wonderful talk, Mikko. One thing this kind of led me to think about was the sort of like the specificity of miniaturing. Can you go back to the slide where you had the miniaturing, the last slide in which you discussed, where you have
this one.
Kind of like the list of aspects. This one.
This one, yep.
I was kind of like thinking about like what you have here, and I would argue, or let's say someone might argue that that all these aspects mentioned here can be connected to many different kinds of game cultures. Also, those envelop in digital games. So I'm kind of like wondering, or maybe you could kind of like elaborate a bit, does the kind of the study of miniaturing bring something entirely new to the field of game studies, or is it more about kind of like the sort of like the nuances and kind of like center staging, maybe a bit different perspectives on aspects or kind of phenomena we also see in other places?
That's a very good question or a question or a comment. I'm sorry.
Please repeat the question.
Oh yes. So basically, what Olli was asking was that what is the kind of added value of studying miniaturing when a lot of these, or arguably all of these, can also be found in different types of gaming, such as digital games, for example. Was this an accurate representation? I agree. They can be found. I do think it's valuable just for illuminating this kind of niche of gaming culture. Like I do think that it's valuable in itself to look at this kind of specific phenomenon, and it also brings up a lot of really interesting comparison points to different kinds of gaming culture. For example, as I was discussing the collecting part, the pile of shame, I assume a lot of digital gamers are also aware of the Steam sale phenomenon. Most of us, I assume, have long backlogs of games that we don't have any time to play. Board gamers have the shelf of shame, which is basically the same kind of thing. People who are doing handicrafts, like knitters, they have their kind of baskets of shame of yarn that they haven't used yet and that they buy a lot of. So I think it's really interesting to look at these broader phenomena that cut through different cultures of gaming. Something that I do think that is very unique in miniaturing is the kind of there are some specifics that I think make it especially interesting. For example, the crafting aspect, which is, while we have like game modifications or this kind of thing, or game jamming in digital gaming, we still don't have this kind of similar tradition of sort of working with your hands, working with working with physical objects that kind of draws miniaturing closer to the realm of something like knitting or woodwork or something like this, rather than traditional gaming culture or different gaming cultures. There is the kind of there is the storytelling aspect that takes it from just games to more like a written expression, artistic expression direction, and also to the domain of free play instead of gaming. So so that kind of side path takes us closer to this sort of like a Paideia style of free play and using fantasy. There is the displaying and appreciating, which takes it closer to art. So we can also utilize perspectives from art research, and it's these kinds of things that, while a lot of these things can be found in game cultures, and arguably some of those can also, the things I mentioned, some of them can also be found in digital gaming, for example. I think there are a fascinating amount of things that are quite specific to miniaturing as well, and especially when you bring all these elements together in a kind of like an overlapping thing that the pastime consists of. So a long rambling answer. I hope this addressed something of it.
All right. Heikki Tyni on YouTube asks, how much in common does researching miniatures have with researching adult toy play, for example, studies by Kati Heliak?
A lot. So there was a question of how closely is miniaturing research related to researching adult toy play, such as the work by Kati Heljakka. And as it happens, Kati Heljakka with Jaakko and myself, Kati has been an extremely valuable member of our research team. So there is a lot in common there. Arguably, you could very well say that a large part of miniaturing is adult toy play. We have refrained from making like these kind of like strict definitions. Miniatures are different things to different people. Some people view them as toys. Others view them as definitely not toys. I especially liked how one of our respondents in the study mentioned that, you know, it even says in the miniatures packaging that this is not a toy. So that's the definition thing done there. So, but yes, so there is a big it's very close to adult toy play research. There's a lot of common ground there.
All right, then Aasa on YouTube asks, any thoughts on how 3D printing might change the whole miniature industry in the future?
So there's a question on how 3D printing will change the miniature printing industry in the future. That's a very interesting question. Personally, I already see that it's changing my miniaturing a lot. My consumer practices, especially, where I used to previously buy a lot of miniatures as physical miniatures. The combination of the proliferation of 3D printing and high quality 3D printing using resin printers, and then the onset of Brexit, which made ordering things from the UK much more complicated and expensive. The combination of these two factors have meant that I buy nowadays, I think, almost 90%, if not more, of my miniatures as digital files. When talking about the pile of shame dimension, they don't take up any space. I have gigs and gigs of files that are quietly sitting on my hard drive. They are maybe taking up some mental space that I should maybe print them up and do something with them, but they are not the physical objects that I need to store somewhere. I do think that the industry is already changing. I do think that 3D printing is just going to get bigger and bigger. I assume that a lot of manufacturers are going to start offering their miniatures as kind of hybrids, where you can either order them as physical objects or you can buy them as STL files to print yourself. And some companies are already doing this. And I think this is something that will definitely increase. I don't think that that traditional miniatures, I don't think that they will die out. There is, and I assume that there will always be, in the foreseeable 10 years or so at least, 3D printing is going to be some kind of a hassle always, until it becomes like very consumer friendly. It's already quite consumer friendly, but it's still a long way from going to the shop and buying a box of ready-made plastic miniatures that you can take home. But I do think that there will be maybe this kind of balance shift. I assume that with the rise in metal prices, metal miniatures will be becoming more and more rare in the future. I assume that eventually they will be a very niche kind of collector thing for people who really want the heftier metal pieces, who want the kind of weight to their models. But of course, I would love to see, metal miniatures in the future as well, because they're not only a kind of link to the past of the hobby, but they also have a certain physical presence that lighter materials don't have. And this is another of these weird kind of things where the heft of the model matters.
All right. I had one question which kind of from the future to the past. What makes Nottingham so uniquely placed, in terms of the history of miniaturing? Why did that start kind of in? I used to live in Nottingham, and that's where Games Workshop kind of. I was wondering, what did you think about the sociocultural kind of factors as to why this hobby starts in such a big way in the British Midlands with its labouring class history and all that?
that's a very interesting question that I probably don't have a very a very satisfying answer to. So there was a question of why did Nottingham, especially in the English Midlands, become such a kind of haven for miniatures and miniaturing. I do think that there is maybe this sort of thing where you have creative people of similar interests coming together, kind of like you have the like urban developments, where the artists will take over some area of cheaper rundown buildings, and then it will start becoming a kind of like an artist mecca sort of thing. I do think that there was something like this maybe going on in the 80s and or the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and of course I do think that then similar people with similar interests will start to kind of migrate. People will leave different companies and studios and set up their own companies, and if they're already living somewhere, then they will maybe set up their own studio or their own company in the same town. And if you have the casters, for example, who cast the miniatures, if they're living in a city, and I know at least a couple who live in Nottingham, then it also makes sense to have your designers quite close to the casters. But this is probably something that it would be really fascinating to consult some of the kind of like miniature historians, such as like I should maybe ask a friend of mine, David Wood, who is looking into the early history of miniatures, or the 70s history, 60s history. But this is a very fascinating thing. I do think that there was something similar as well to, for example, in Nokia in Finland, when Nokia kind of didn't go under, but when it was sort of run down, so a lot of engineers and a lot of Nokia's designers went off, and that was a big boost to the gaming industry, for example, because all of a sudden you had a lot of people with a lot of industry experience and skill and networks and connections, and they were forming these new companies and having new ideas. So maybe there was something similar. Maybe there has been something similar going on in the lead belt as well. And of course, this kind of networking happens. So if a lot of your peers and other manufacturers are already operating in an area, then if you are considering relocating, then maybe you might as well move there where the networks are already kind of exist. And of course, it's still a very niche industry, so I assume that a lot of it is based on personal contacts and personal networks as well, because a lot of the miniature companies are 1 or 2 person kind of small studios. So in that case, probably this kind of resource pooling also becomes important.
Okay, I hope there's a question in here, but regarding entry-level miniatures and upbringing and such, and a short story. I spent my weekend with my friend and his kids, one of them being my goddaughter, and we went to my friend's office space, and he was fixing some floor stuff there, and me and the kids were watching YouTube videos about diorama creation, and we had just watched Hall's Moving Castle, and we watched how they create the Hall's Moving Castle from trash, and so she got really into that and has been apparently for a long while. And after we left the office, she took the packaging materials to her home to fix something. But if I would, for example, buy something to her, what should I buy? Kind of like to get her into that sort of field without the miniatures being about weapons and guns and gore.
Oh, that's a very good question. So there was basically a question of what to buy, like what to buy a child who is interested in miniatures, but without like a heavy emphasis on the kind of like military aspects of miniaturing. I would definitely look into I would definitely look into Dungeons and Dragons miniatures, for example, because a lot of fantasy miniatures have a very broad range of different creatures, you know, and not just the kind of warrior types. You have the magicians, you have the princes and princesses, you have the unicorns and Pegasi and all things like this. You have different miniature lines for, you know, you have My Little Pony miniatures, for example. You have chibi miniatures for some, if people are interested in chibi anime or manga, for example. So, you know, big eyes, small mouth kind of characters. Currently, I think the selection is so broad that you can find a lot of stuff that is not very militarily oriented. You can get, and also, you know, if you want something quite neutral, you can also get a lot of miniatures of animals, for example. And this kind of thing, I would suggest going over to your local gaming store, or just, you know, viewing a catalog of a manufacturer like Reaper Miniatures, for example, who have an extensive fantasy and science fiction catalog. And I'm sure that you can find tons of interesting things without a lot of guns and swords and gore and fascism.
All right, thank you. I think we'll end here. So thank you, Mikko.
Thank you.
And we have at the moment, I think, 2 further OASIS Lunchtime Talks planned for the spring season. There's probably going to be one on the 12th of May. We have not yet secured who is going to be talking, but that is the likeliest next date for an OASIS talk. And then there's the bonus session probably going to take place in the beginning of June, when Ursula Freeman is defending her dissertation, and we're trying to get her opponent to also, Emma Witkowski, to give a talk here. We'll see how that goes. But those are the ones that are now on the horizon. If there are sort of people who you would love to invite here, or people you think sort of would have something nice to say, sort of do